Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most beautiful lies, a carefully constructed fantasy of elegance, refinement, and purity that has captivated our imaginations for over a century. We're going to explore the Victorian era, that golden age of manners and morals, of crinolines and tea parties, of proper ladies and gentlemen who supposedly embodied cleanliness, godliness, and everything civilized. Before we dive into this fascinating and frankly shocking story, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you. I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed scrolling through your phone, perhaps fresh from a hot shower, surrounded by modern conveniences you probably take for granted? Are you curled up on the couch in clean pajamas, maybe sipping some tea, confident that your home is sanitary and safe? Tonight, I want you to appreciate those simple comforts, because as we step into the supposedly pristine Victorian world, we'll discover that the reality behind those elegant facades was often horrifying, disgusting, and deadly. Wherever you are, I want you to dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back to an era when appearances were everything, and the truth was carefully hidden behind perfume, powder, and denial. What if I told you that the average Victorian lady, dressed in her beautiful silk gown and corseted to perfection, bathed fully only once or twice a year? What if I told you that Queen Victoria herself, the very symbol of Victorian propriety, believed that bathing too frequently was not only unnecessary, but actually dangerous to one's health? What if I told you that in 1850s London, the largest and wealthiest city in the world, human waste was dumped directly into the River Thames, the same river from which millions of people drew their drinking water, leading to cholera epidemics that killed tens of thousands? According to research by Dr. Lee Jackson from the University of London, whose work on Victorian sanitation reveals the shocking gap between perception and reality, the Victorian era was actually one of the filthiest periods in human history, particularly in the rapidly growing industrial cities where poverty, overcrowding, and complete lack of understanding about disease transmission created conditions we would find absolutely unimaginable today. Think about that for a moment. We imagine Victorian ladies as paragons of cleanliness, their homes as spotless havens of domestic perfection, their cities as orderly and well managed. But the reality was starkly different. These were people who believed that disease came from bad air or miasma rather than germs, who thought fresh air was dangerous and kept their windows sealed tight, who covered every surface with heavy fabrics that trapped dirt and bacteria, and who lived in cities where the streets literally ran with human and animal waste. Tonight, I am going to take you inside this world to meet real people who lived through this era of beautiful denial, to explore the actual practices that passed for hygiene, and to understand how a society so obsessed with propriety and appearance could simultaneously live in conditions of spectacular filth. You'll discover the truth about Victorian bathing habits, or the lack thereof, the horrifying reality of urban sanitation, the dangerous beauty practices that poisoned women slowly, the deadly misinformation about disease and cleanliness that killed millions, and the small revolutions that eventually brought change. We'll explore why these myths persist, what they reveal about class, gender, and power in Victorian society, and how the Victorians themselves were complicit in creating the sanitized image of their era that we still believe today. Let me tell you about Eleanor Hartley, a middle-class Victorian woman living in Manchester, England in 1855. Eleanor is 28 years old, married to a moderately successful cotton merchant, and she considers herself a refined and proper lady. Her home is elegantly furnished with heavy velvet curtains, thick carpets, and ornate furniture. She dresses impeccably, spending hours each morning on her toilet, arranging her hair, applying her makeup, and lacing herself into her corset until she can barely breathe. To any observer, Eleanor is the picture of Victorian elegance and cleanliness. But here is what that observer wouldn't know. Eleanor hasn't had a full bath in 4 months. According to research by historian Ruth Goodman, whose work on Victorian daily life draws on extensive primary sources, including diaries, household manuals, and medical texts. This was completely normal for a respectable Victorian woman of Eleanor's class. Bathing, in the sense we understand it, was considered dangerous, potentially fatal even, because Victorians believed that immersing the body in water opened the pores and made one vulnerable to disease. Eleanor's morning toilet involves washing her face, neck and hands with cold water from a basin in her bedroom. She might, if she is feeling particularly thorough, wash under her arms with a damp cloth, but the rest of her body goes unwashed for months at a time. Her undergarments, the multiple layers of chemises, petticoats and drawers are changed regularly, maybe every few days, and Victorians believed that changing linen was essentially equivalent to washing the body. The theory was that the linen absorbed the body's dirt and oils, so as long as you changed your underclothes, your body stayed clean. According to Dr. Sally Mitchell from Temple University, whose research on Victorian women's daily lives reveals the gap between prescription and practice, this belief was so ingrained that Victorian medical texts actually warned against bathing too frequently. One popular health manual from 1850 advised that women should bathe no more than once a month, and then only in lukewarm water for no more than 10 minutes, as hot water and prolonged immersion could cause weakness, fainting, or even death. But here is what really gets me about Eleanor's situation. She genuinely believes she is clean. She is following all the rules of her society, doing everything a respectable woman is supposed to do. She changes her linen regularly. She washes her visible skin. She uses perfumes and powders to mask any odors. And she maintains her home according to the standards of her class. The fact that she probably has body odor we would find unbearable, that her unwashed skin is likely irritated and possibly infected, that her heavy clothing is literally breeding bacteria, none of this occurs to her because she has no concept of germs or bacteria. Her worldview, her entire understanding of cleanliness and health, is fundamentally different from ours. And what is truly heartbreaking is that when Eleanor eventually dies in 1858 at age 31 from what the death certificate calls fever, she is actually a victim of typhoid contracted from the contaminated water that comes from the tap in her elegant middle-class home. Now, let me tell you about Thomas Crapper. Yes, that is his real name, a plumber working in London in the 1860s. Thomas didn't actually invent the flush toilet as legend suggests, but he did improve and popularize it, and his name becoming slang for the device is one of history's perfect coincidences. According to research by Dr. Lara Baker from King's College London, whose work on Victorian sanitation infrastructure reveals the shocking state of urban waste management, Thomas was working in a city where human waste disposal was creating a crisis of unprecedented proportions. In 1858, just a few years before Thomas set up his plumbing business, London experienced what became known as the Great Stink, when a hot summer caused the Thames, which was essentially an open sewer, to smell so horrifically that Parliament had to suspend sessions because the members couldn't bear the stench. Let me paint you a picture of London in the 1850s. The capital of the British Empire, the wealthiest and most powerful city in the world. London's population had exploded from about 1 million in 1800 to over 2.5 million by 1850, but the infrastructure for handling human waste hadn't kept pace. Most homes had cesspits, basically holes in the ground lined with brick where human waste accumulated. These cesspits were supposed to be emptied regularly by night soilmen who would cart the waste away, but in practice they often overflowed, leaking into basements, contaminating wells and seeping into the groundwater. According to historian Stephen Johnson, whose book on the 1854 cholera outbreak documents the sanitary conditions in shocking detail, it was estimated that there were approximately 200,000 cesspits in London in the mid-19th century, many of them poorly maintained or completely full. But here is where it gets even worse. In the 1840s, in an effort to reduce the cesspit problem, authorities began encouraging people to install water closets, early toilets that flushed waste away with water. Sounds like progress, right? Except that all these new toilets flushed directly into the existing sewer system, which wasn't designed for liquid waste and which emptied directly into the Thames. So the river that supplied much of London's drinking water became a toxic soup of human excrement, industrial waste, and animal carcasses. The result was predictable and catastrophic. Cholera epidemics in 1832, 1848 to 49, 1854, and 1866 killed over 40,000 Londoners. According to Professor Bill Luckin from the University of Bolton, whose research on Victorian public health reveals the deadly consequences of inadequate sanitation, working-class neighbourhoods where people had no choice but to drink Thames, water had mortality rates from cholera of up to 150 deaths per 10,000 population during epidemic years. Thomas Crapper's improved toilets were part of the solution, but the real change came when engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed and built London's modern sewer system in the 1860s, an engineering marvel that redirected waste away from the Thames and out to sea. But think about what it took to get to that point. Decades of disease, tens of thousands of deaths, Parliament literally unable to function because of the stench, before authorities acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, having millions of people defecate into their drinking water source wasn't a great plan. And even then, the sewer system was built not primarily because of concerns about disease, which wasn't fully understood yet, but because the smell had become unbearable to the wealthy and powerful. The Great Stink of 1858 did what the deaths of tens of thousands of poor Londoners couldn't. It forced change because it inconvenienced the rich. Now let me tell you about Dr. John Snow, and I want you to remember his story, because it is one of the most important in the history of public health, even though it wasn't fully appreciated in his own time. In 1854, in the Soho district of London, a cholera outbreak killed over 600 people in just a few weeks. According to research by Dr. Ralph Frerich from UCLA, whose work documents Snow's investigation in meticulous detail, Dr. Snow was one of the few people at the time who believed that cholera was transmitted through contaminated water rather than through bad air or miasma. When the Soho outbreak occurred, Snow did something revolutionary. He created a map plotting every cholera death and looked for patterns. What he found was that the deaths clustered around a single water pump on Broad Street. Snow examined the pump and the water source and found that a CS bit just 3 feet away from the well was leaking sewage into the water supply. Here is what gets me about Snow's story. He presented his evidence to authorities, showing them clearly that the Broad Street pump was the source of the outbreak, and he convinced them to remove the pump handle so people couldn't use it. The outbreak subsided almost immediately. You'd think this would have been a eureka moment, right? Proof that cholera came from contaminated water, not bad air, but most of the medical establishment refused to believe it. The miasma theory was too deeply entrenched. Influential physicians like William Farr continued to insist that cholera was caused by bad air from decaying organic matter, and it would be decades before germ theory was fully accepted. According to Professor John Eiler from the University of Minnesota, whose research on Victorian epidemiology documents the slow acceptance of waterborne disease transmission, it wasn't until the 1880s and 1890s, decades after Snow's death in 1858, that his theories about cholera transmission were widely accepted and incorporated into public health policy. Think about that level of resistance to evidence. Snow literally showed them the pattern, mapped the deaths, identified the source, removed the contaminated water, and watched the outbreak end, and still the establishment refused to believe him. Why? Because accepting that water could transmit disease would mean accepting that their entire infrastructure, their entire system of urban living, was fundamentally flawed and dangerous. It would mean massive investment in new sewers, new water systems, new ways of thinking about public health. It was easier to cling to miasma theory, to believe that disease came from bad smells that could be addressed with better ventilation and maybe some cleaning, than to face the reality that their cities were literally poisoning their populations through contaminated water. Let me tell you about Charlotte Evans, a maid working in an upper-class household in London in 1870. Charlotte is 19 years old, working 14-hour days, 6 days a week, cleaning and maintaining a large townhouse in Belgravia. Her employers, the Thornton family, pride themselves on running an impeccable household, and Charlotte's job is to ensure that everything looks perfect, every surface gleaming, every room spotless. According to research by historian Lucy Lethbridge, whose work on Victorian domestic service draws on extensive interviews and memoirs, Charlotte's daily cleaning routine would shock us today, because what the Victorians considered clean and what we consider clean are vastly different things. Charlotte starts her day at 5:30 a.m., lighting fires in all the fireplaces, a task that fills the house with smoke and ash that will settle on every surface. She empties chamber pots, the portable toilets kept in bedrooms because indoor plumbing is still rare even in wealthy homes in 1870, carrying the waste down multiple flights of stairs to be dumped in the cesspit or water closet. She dusts the furniture and ornaments, but here is the thing, she uses a feather duster or a dry cloth, just pushing the dust around rather than actually removing it. Victorians didn't understand that dust could carry disease or allergens. They just wanted surfaces to look clean. Charlotte beats the heavy carpets and curtains occasionally, sending clouds of dust and who knows what else into the air. But mostly they just accumulate dirt, animal dander, mold, and whatever the family tracked in from the filthy streets outside. The kitchen, where Charlotte spends much of her time, is a particular horror from a modern sanitation perspective. According to Dr. Pamela Horn from the University of Reading, whose research on Victorian kitchens reveals the shocking food safety practices, there was no refrigeration, so meat and dairy were kept in cool pantries where they often spoiled before being used. There was no understanding of cross-contamination, so the same cutting board might be used for raw meat and then for vegetables without washing. Hand washing wasn't standard practice before food preparation. Flies were everywhere in summer, landing on food, and this was just accepted as normal. The water used for cooking and cleaning came from the same questionable sources as drinking water, potentially contaminated with sewage. Charlotte herself probably bathes once a month, if that in a tin tub in the servants' quarters, using water that multiple servants share, one after another, each bathing in water that is progressively dirtier. Her uniform, which she wears every day, is washed maybe once a week. Her hands, which handle food, clean chamber pots, dust surfaces, empty ash from fireplaces and perform dozens of other tasks, are washed with cold water and harsh soap that strips the skin, making it crack and bleed, creating perfect entry points for bacteria. According to research on Victorian servants' health, domestic servants had high rates of respiratory diseases from constant exposure to coal dust and smoke, skin infections from harsh cleaning chemicals and poor hygiene, and digestive ailments from the food they ate and the water they drank. But here is what really breaks my heart about Charlotte's situation. The Thornton family she works for, her employers who consider themselves so refined and clean, never think about the conditions Charlotte lives in. She sleeps in a tiny attic room that is freezing in winter and sweltering in summer, with no heat and barely any ventilation. She eats leftovers and inferior food in the servants' hall. She has access to the same contaminated water as the family, but none of the medical care they can afford when she gets sick. And when Charlotte develops a persistent cough in 1872, the Thorntons let her go, unwilling to keep a sick servant, and she ends up in a workhouse where she dies of tuberculosis at age 21. The Thorntons feel they've made the right decision, protecting their family from illness, never considering that the conditions they force their servants to work in virtually guarantee sickness. Now let me tell you about Victorian beauty standards and the horrifying practices women endured in the name of achieving the pale, delicate look that was fashionable. Meet Amelia Preston, a young woman from a respectable middle-class family in Birmingham in 1875. Amelia is 22, hoping to make a good marriage, and she is desperate to achieve the pale, almost translucent complexion that is considered the height of beauty in her era. According to research by Dr. Sarah Schaffer from Harvard University, whose work on Victorian cosmetics reveals the dangerous ingredients in common beauty products, Amelia is literally poisoning herself in pursuit of beauty, and she has no idea. Amelia uses a popular face powder that contains lead and arsenic. She has read in ladies' magazines that these powders create the most beautiful pale complexion, making the skin look refined and delicate. What she doesn't know is that the lead is being absorbed through her skin, accumulating in her body, slowly poisoning her. She is also using belladonna drops in her eyes to make her pupils dilate, creating what is considered an attractive doe-eyed look. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, is a powerful toxin, and putting drops of it in her eyes is causing blurred vision, light sensitivity, and potential damage to her corneas. She is also taking arsenic wafers, which are marketed as beautifying complexes that improve the complexion from within. These wafers contain small amounts of arsenic, and while the dose in each wafer isn't immediately deadly, accumulated over time, they're slowly poisoning her. According to Professor Carolyn Day from Furman University, whose research on Victorian beauty culture documents the dangerous practices women engaged in arsenic poisoning from cosmetics and beauty wafers was common enough that doctors of the era recognized the symptoms: digestive problems, hair loss, skin lesions, and eventually organ failure. But the connection between cosmetics and these symptoms wasn't widely accepted, partly because cosmetics manufacturers denied any danger, and partly because women themselves often refused to believe that their beauty products could be harmful. Vanity and social pressure were stronger than evidence. But here is what is even more disturbing. Amelia is also wearing a corset that is laced so tightly she can barely breathe. Victorian fashion demanded a tiny waist, and achieving this required compressing the internal organs to an unnatural and dangerous degree. According to research by Dr. Rebecca Gibson from Coventry University, whose work on Victorian fashion and women's health reveals the physical damage caused by extreme corseting, women who wore tightly laced corsets for years often developed permanent deformation of their rib cages, displacement of internal organs, digestive problems from compressed stomachs and intestines, respiratory issues from inability to fully expand their lungs, and miscarriages from pressure on the uterus. Amelia wears her corset from the moment she wakes until she goes to bed, sometimes sleeping in a looser version, because she has been told that sleeping without a corset will cause her body to spread and become unshapely. She experiences frequent fainting spells, which are so common among corseted Victorian women that special fainting couches are a standard piece of furniture in middle-class homes. She has chronic indigestion and constipation from her compressed digestive system. She is frequently short of breath and can't walk upstairs without pausing to rest. But she considers all of this a worthwhile price for beauty, for conforming to the ideal of the delicate, fragile Victorian lady. What she doesn't know is that by the time she is 35, her internal organs will be so displaced that she'll suffer from chronic pain and digestive issues for the rest of her life. The price of beauty in the Victorian era wasn't just vanity, it was genuine, permanent physical damage, and women paid it willingly because the social pressure to conform was overwhelming. Let me tell you about Victorian medical practices, because understanding how doctors of the era thought about cleanliness helps explain why hygiene was so poor. Meet Dr. Charles Whitmore, a respected physician practicing in London in 1865. Dr. Whitmore has studied at the finest medical schools. He is well read in all the latest medical theories, and he genuinely cares about his patients. He is also completely wrong about almost everything related to disease transmission and hygiene. According to research by Professor Michael Werboys from the University of Manchester, whose work on Victorian medicine documents the slow and painful transition from miasma theory to germ theory, Doctors like Whitmore were practicing medicine in an era when the basic mechanisms of disease were fundamentally misunderstood. Dr. Whitmore believes that disease is caused by miasma, bad air arising from decaying organic matter, swamps, sewers, and crowded living conditions. He believes that disease can be prevented by ensuring good ventilation, avoiding bad smells, and maintaining what he considers proper sanitation, which means keeping visible filth at bay, but has nothing to do with actual bacterial contamination. When Dr. Whitmore performs surgery, he does so in his regular street clothes, often a black coat that is stained with blood and pus from previous surgeries. He considers these stains marks of his experience, proof of his busy and successful practice. He doesn't wash his hands before surgery or between patients. The concept of sterilization doesn't exist in his practice. His surgical instruments are wiped clean with a cloth between uses, but they're not boiled or treated in any way to kill bacteria, according to Dr. Lindsay Fitch-Harris, a medical historian whose research on Victorian surgery reveals the shocking mortality rates. Surgical mortality in the 1860s was approximately 40 to 50%, not primarily from the surgery itself, but from post-operative infections that were essentially guaranteed by the unsanitary conditions. Patients who survived the actual surgical procedure often died days or weeks later from sepsis, gangrene, or other infections. Dr. Whitmore sees this as inevitable, a natural risk of surgery, never understanding that he and his colleagues are the ones causing these deaths through their failure to maintain basic hygiene. But here is what is truly fascinating and tragic. Dr. Whitmore knows about the work of Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician who in the 1840s demonstrated that hand washing with chlorinated lime solution dramatically reduced mortality from puerperal fever in maternity wards. Semmelweis showed that mortality rates dropped from 18% to less than 2% when doctors washed their hands before examining women in childbirth. But Semmelweis's findings were rejected by the medical establishment, partly because they were insulted by the suggestion that doctors could be the source of infection, and partly because his theory contradicted accepted miasma theory. Semmelweis was eventually committed to an asylum, where he died in 1865, the same year Dr. Whitmore continues his surgical practice in London, unaware that simply washing his hands could save dozens of lives. It is not until the 1860s and 1870s when Joseph Lister begins promoting antiseptic surgery using carbolic acid to kill bacteria that surgical mortality begins to decline. But even then, adoption is slow because many doctors resist the idea that they need to change their practices. According to Professor Thomas Schlick from McGill University, whose research on the history of surgery documents the resistance to antiseptic and later aseptic techniques, many Victorian doctors found Lister's methods cumbersome and were convinced that their traditional practices were adequate. The transition from accepting that dirty hands and instruments caused infection to actually implementing consistent hygiene practices took decades, and thousands of patients died unnecessarily during that time. Now, let me tell you about Victorian childhood, because the hygiene practices around children were particularly horrifying. Meet Sarah and William Thompson, parents of 5 children living in Manchester in 1860. Sarah and William are working class, struggling to survive in an industrial city where the air is thick with coal smoke, the water is questionable, and overcrowding makes disease inevitable, according to research by Professor Anne Hardy from the Wellcome Trust Centre for the History of Medicine, whose work on Victorian childhood mortality reveals the devastating impact of poor hygiene and sanitation. Working-class families like the Thompsons faced child mortality rates of approximately 150 deaths per 1,000 live births, meaning that 15% of children died before their first birthday, and nearly 30% didn't survive to age 5. Sarah's approach to infant care reflects the beliefs of her time and class. When her babies are born, they're wrapped tightly in swaddling cloths. that aren't changed frequently because washing and drying cloth is labour intensive when you don't have running water or modern laundry facilities. The baby might stay in the same swaddling for days, lying in their own waste, developing terrible rashes and infections. Sarah breastfeeds if she can, which is actually one of the few things that improves infant survival because it is safer than the alternatives. But if she can't breastfeed or needs to supplement, she might use pap, a mixture of bread or flour mixed with water or sometimes ale, fed to the baby in a cloth that the baby sucks on. This cloth is rarely washed and becomes a breeding ground for bacteria. According to Dr. Deborah Brunton from the Open University, whose research on Victorian infant feeding practices documents the dangers of artificial feeding, babies who were bottle-fed had mortality rates 2 to 3 times higher than breastfed babies, primarily because of contaminated bottles, contaminated milk, and inappropriate food substitutes. Bottles were difficult to clean thoroughly, milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, and the rubber tubing used in some bottle designs was impossible to clean adequately and harbour dangerous bacteria. Sarah doesn't know this. She is just trying to keep her babies alive with the knowledge and resources available to her. The Thompson children who survive infancy face other hazards. They play in streets that are open sewers, where human and animal waste mixes with industrial runoff and trash. They're constantly exposed to disease, dirt, and pollution. They probably bathe only occasionally, maybe once a month in summer, less in winter when heating water is too expensive. Their clothes are worn until they literally fall apart, washed infrequently, because the family has so few garments that they can't spare any for washing. According to research on Victorian working-class life, it wasn't uncommon for families to share clothing, with children wearing hand-me-downs that had been worn by multiple siblings, and were rarely, if ever, truly clean. But here is what really gets to me. Sarah is doing her best. She loves her children. She is working desperately hard to keep them alive in conditions of poverty that we can barely imagine. When her daughter Mary dies of scarlet fever at age 4 in 1862, when her son Thomas dies of diphtheria at age 2 in 1864, Sarah grieves desperately, but she also accepts these deaths as God's will, as the natural order of things, because she has no understanding that many of these deaths are preventable, caused by conditions that could be changed with proper sanitation, clean water, and basic hygiene practices that haven't been invented yet or haven't reached her level of society. Let me tell you about the other end of the social spectrum, because even the wealthy, who had resources to be cleaner, often weren't much better off when it came to understanding hygiene. Meet Lady Catherine Ashford, an aristocrat living in a grand country estate in Yorkshire in 1870. Lady Catherine has wealth, servants, beautiful clothing, and every material comfort. But she also has beliefs about health and hygiene that seem bizarre to us today. According to research by Professor Jessica Gerard from the University of Delaware, whose work on Victorian aristocratic life reveals the domestic practices of the upper classes, wealthy Victorians had their own set of hygiene myths that were often just as dangerous as the practices of the poor, just dressed up in more elegant packaging. Lady Catherine believes that night air is dangerous, so she keeps all her bedroom windows tightly shut even in summer, sleeping in a room that becomes stuffy and oxygen depleted. She believes that drafts can cause illness, so her home is sealed up tight, with heavy curtains covering every window and door. The result is poor air circulation, rooms that are breeding grounds for mold and bacteria, and an environment where airborne diseases like tuberculosis can spread easily. She bathes more frequently than working-class women, perhaps once a week or every 2 weeks, but she still considers frequent bathing dangerous and believes that the water should be no more than lukewarm to avoid shocking the system. Lady Catherine's wealth allows her to hide dirt rather than eliminate it. Her home is full of heavy fabrics, thick carpets, elaborate draperies, upholstered furniture, all of which trap dust, dirt, and allergens. These textiles are beaten occasionally to remove surface dirt, but they're rarely truly cleaned, and they harbour insects, mould, and who knows what else. According to research by historian Judith Flanders, whose work on Victorian domestic life documents the cleaning practices of the era, wealthy Victorian homes were actually quite dirty beneath their elegant surfaces. The technology for truly cleaning all those fabrics didn't exist, and the Victorians' obsession with covering every surface meant that dirt accumulated invisibly. Lady Catherine's kitchen, run by her servants, has better hygiene than a working-class kitchen simply because there are more resources, but it is still far from clean by modern standards. Food is stored in cool pantries that aren't really cold enough to prevent spoilage. Meat hangs in larders where flies can access it. Milk is delivered daily but has no guarantee of cleanliness from the source. Servants handle food without understanding cross-contamination or the importance of hand-washing. Lady Catherine herself never enters the kitchen, so she has no idea about the actual conditions in which her food is prepared. What is particularly interesting is that Lady Catherine considers herself vastly superior to the working classes, partly because she believes she is cleaner and more refined. But in reality, while she certainly has more resources and better living conditions, she is operating under the same fundamental misunderstandings about disease and hygiene. Her wealth protects her to some degree. She has better nutrition, better medical care when she gets sick, more space to isolate herself from contagious disease, but she is not actually significantly cleaner in practice, just better at maintaining the appearance of cleanliness. Now let me tell you about Victorian death and mourning practices, because these reveal another aspect of the hygiene situation that seems shocking to modern sensibilities. In the Victorian era, death was an ever-present reality. Mortality rates were high, life expectancy was low, and almost everyone experienced the death of family members, often children, multiple times in their lives. According to research by Professor Ruth Richardson from the University of Hertfordshire, whose work on Victorian death culture documents the practices around dying and mourning, Victorians developed elaborate rituals around death, partly as a way of coping with its frequency, and partly as a way of demonstrating social status and respectability. When someone died in a Victorian home, the body wasn't immediately taken away. It stayed in the home, often for several days, until the funeral. The body would be washed and dressed by family members or neighbours, laid out in the parlour or the bedroom, and mourners would come to pay their respects. In an era before embalming was common before refrigeration, this meant that bodies were decomposing in people's homes, in small, poorly ventilated rooms, often during warm weather. According to Dr. Julie Rugg from the University of York, whose research on Victorian burial practices reveals the public health implications, this practice meant that Victorian homes often contained decomposing corpses for days at a time, creating obvious hygiene and health hazards that people accepted as normal and proper. Photography of the dead, particularly of dead children, was common. Families would pose with the deceased, sometimes propping up the body to look almost alive, creating what we now call memento mori photographs. From a modern perspective, this seems macabre, but for Victorians, it was a cherished way to preserve a memory of a loved one, especially children who died before photography of them alive had been possible. Think about that for a moment. The level of familiarity with death, the acceptance of having a decomposing body in your home, the normalcy of posing for photographs with your dead child. It speaks to how different their relationship with death was from ours, partly because they experienced it so much more frequently. Mourning practices themselves were elaborate and strictly codified, especially for women. A widow was expected to wear full black mourning for at least a year, sometimes 2 years, then transition to half mourning with touches of grey or purple for another year. These mourning clothes were made of heavy, dark fabrics that were difficult to clean and that trapped heat and absorbed odours. According to fashion historian Lou Taylor, whose research on Victorian mourning dress documents these practices, women in mourning were essentially wearing the same dark, heavy clothing, day after day for months or years, with minimal washing because the fabrics couldn't withstand frequent laundering. So grieving Victorian widows were not only emotionally devastated, but also physically uncomfortable and probably quite smelly, wrapped in layers of unwashable black fabric. Let me tell you about the slow revolution in thinking that eventually began to change Victorian hygiene practices. The key figures were often people working outside the traditional medical establishment, people who could see patterns and make connections that doctors trained in miasma theory couldn't or wouldn't see. We've talked about John Snow and his cholera investigation. Let me tell you about Florence Nightingale, whose work on hospital hygiene transformed medical care and saved countless lives. Florence Nightingale went to the Crimean War in 1854 as a nurse, and what she found in the British military hospitals was horrifying even by Victorian standards. According to research by Professor Lynn MacDonald from the University of Guelph, who has edited Nightingale's collected works and documented her statistical analysis of hospital mortality, Nightingale discovered that soldiers were more likely to die from disease in the hospital than from their wounds on the battlefield. The hospitals were filthy, overcrowded, poorly ventilated, with patients lying in their own waste, wounds becoming infected, and disease spreading rapidly through the wards. Nightingale implemented systematic changes. She insisted on cleanliness, proper ventilation, clean linens, removal of waste, washing of hands and instruments, and separation of patients with contagious diseases. The mortality rate in the hospitals she supervised dropped from 42% to 2%. She documented this with meticulous statistics, creating innovative charts and graphs to demonstrate the impact of sanitary reforms. When she returned to England, she became a passionate advocate for hospital reform and public health improvements, using her data to convince reluctant authorities that cleanliness and sanitation mattered. But here is what is remarkable. Nightingale still believed in miasma theory. She thought disease was caused by bad air, not germs. Yet her practical focus on cleanliness, ventilation, and sanitation saved lives, even though her understanding of the mechanism was wrong. According to Professor Monica Bailey from the University of London, whose work on Nightingale's nursing reforms documents her influence, Nightingale's insistence on cleanliness and order, even if based on incorrect theory, had the practical effect of reducing bacterial contamination and disease transmission. Sometimes the right practices can emerge from wrong theories if the observations are accurate enough. The transition to germ theory was gradual and met with enormous resistance. In the 1860s and 1870s, scientists like Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany were demonstrating that microorganisms cause disease, that these tiny invisible creatures could make people sick and could be transmitted from person to person. According to research by Professor Nancy Tomes from Stony Brook University, whose work on the history of germ theory documents its slow acceptance in Britain and America, the shift from miasma theory to germ theory required not just scientific evidence, but a complete reimagining of how disease worked. And this was psychologically and culturally difficult for Victorians to accept. Think about what germ theory meant. It meant that the invisible world was dangerous, that things that looked clean might be contaminated, that you couldn't trust your senses to tell you what was safe. It meant that your own hands could be vehicles for disease, that your breath could infect others, that intimate contact with loved ones could spread illness. It required people to be suspicious of the everyday, to see danger in the ordinary, and to adopt new practices like regular hand washing, covering coughs, and sterilizing surfaces that seemed excessive, or even obsessive to people who had lived their whole lives believing that visible cleanliness was sufficient. The acceptance of germ theory came gradually, starting with the medical profession and public health officials, and slowly spreading to the general population. By the 1880s and 1890s, the domestic sanitation movement was teaching middle-class women about the importance of cleanliness in preventing disease. Home economics classes taught girls about proper food handling, cleaning techniques, and personal hygiene. Public health campaigns promoted hand washing, boiling water, and proper sewage disposal. According to Dr. Suellen Hoy from the University of Notre Dame, whose research on American cleanliness culture documents this transition. The late Victorian and Edwardian periods saw an explosion of interest in hygiene, with soap manufacturers, public health officials, and reformers all promoting the gospel of cleanliness. But here is what is fascinating about this transition. It created new anxieties and new forms of class distinction. As germ theory became accepted, cleanliness became not just a practical matter but a moral one. Being clean was associated with being civilized, educated, and respectable. Being dirty became associated with ignorance, immorality, and lower social status. According to research by Professor Philip Saracen from the University of Zurich, whose work on the cultural history of cleanliness reveals how hygiene became intertwined with ideas about class and race, the late Victorian obsession with cleanliness was often used to justify social hierarchies, with middle and upper classes portraying themselves as inherently cleaner and more civilized than the working classes and colonized peoples. Let me tell you about how Victorian hygiene myths persist in our modern imagination, and why it matters that we understand the reality. The image of the Victorian era as clean, proper, and refined is a fantasy created largely by the Victorians themselves and perpetuated by nostalgia, period dramas, and our tendency to romanticize the past. We see the beautiful clothes, the elegant homes, the formal manners, and we imagine cleanliness and order. We don't see the unwashed bodies beneath those beautiful clothes, the filth hidden by those elegant homes, the disease and death that lurked behind those formal manners. This myth matters because it distorts our understanding of history and social progress. When we imagine the Victorians as clean and our ancestors as having always valued hygiene, we fail to appreciate how recent many of our modern health practices actually are. Regular bathing, daily changing of undergarments, hand washing before meals and after using the toilet, brushing teeth daily, these practices that seem so fundamental and obvious to us are actually quite new. Products of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when germ theory finally became widely accepted and put into practice. The Victorian era teaches us something important about the gap between appearance and reality, between what a society claims to value and what it actually practices. The Victorians prided themselves on their propriety, their morality, their refinement, and they created elaborate social codes around cleanliness and respectability. But beneath that surface, they were living in conditions of spectacular filth, dying in their thousands from preventable diseases, and refusing to accept evidence that contradicted their cherished beliefs. Sound familiar? Every era has its own blind spots, its own gaps between appearance and reality, its own resistance to uncomfortable truths. What really gets to me as I think about these Victorian stories is the unnecessary suffering, the preventable deaths, the women who poisoned themselves with beauty products, the children who died from contaminated water, the patients who died from infections their doctors gave them, the families who lived in squalor while maintaining appearances of respectability. How many lives could have been saved if evidence had been accepted sooner, if hand-washing had been adopted when Semmelweis first demonstrated its effectiveness, if water supplies had been protected before cholera killed tens of thousands, if toxic cosmetics had been banned when their dangers became apparent. But I also want to emphasize compassion for the Victorians. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. Eleanor, bathing only twice a year, wasn't being deliberately dirty. She was following the medical advice of her time. Dr. Whitmore, operating in his blood-stained coat without washing his hands, wasn't malicious. He genuinely didn't understand how disease transmission worked. Sarah Thompson, watching her children die, wasn't negligent. She was trapped in poverty and ignorance that weren't her fault. These were people operating within systems of belief and knowledge that we now know were wrong, but that seemed reasonable and correct to them at the time. The Victorian era also shows us the power of evidence and reform. Once germ theory was established, once the connection between sanitation and disease was proven beyond doubt, change came relatively quickly. Within a generation, cities built modern sewer systems, water treatment became standard, hand washing became routine, and mortality rates began to decline dramatically. The life expectancy in Britain in 1850 was approximately 40 years. By 1900, it had risen to 48 years, and by 1920 to 56 years. Much of this improvement came from better hygiene and sanitation, from accepting new knowledge and changing old practices. As we come to the end of tonight's journey into Victorian hygiene, I want you to think about the layers of myth and reality in how we view the past. The elegant Victorian lady in her silk gown, admired in portraits and period dramas, was probably unwashed, corseted so tightly she could barely breathe, and slowly poisoning herself with lead-based cosmetics. The grand Victorian home, with its heavy draperies and ornate furniture, was probably full of dust, mould and insects, with contaminated water coming from the taps and human waste improperly disposed of in the backyard. The respected Victorian doctor in his black coat was probably spreading disease to his patients through his unwashed hands and unsterilised instruments. Understanding this reality doesn't diminish the Victorians' very real achievements in art, literature, engineering, and social reform, but it does give us a more accurate and complete picture of their lives, their struggles, and their limitations. It helps us appreciate how far we've come in terms of public health and hygiene, and it reminds us that progress is possible even when it seems slow and difficult. Think about your modern life for a moment. You probably showered today, or at least yesterday. You probably washed your hands multiple times without even thinking about it. You probably drank water without worrying whether it would give you cholera. You probably used a toilet that flushes waste safely away to a treatment plant instead of into your drinking water source. You probably ate food that was refrigerated, prepared on surfaces that were disinfected by people who washed their hands. These simple, everyday practices that you take for granted would seem like miracles to Eleanor Hartley, Sarah Thompson, or any of the other Victorians we've met tonight. But let's also think about our own blind spots. What are we doing today that future generations will look back on with horror and disbelief? What evidence are we ignoring? What uncomfortable truths are we denying? What practices are we maintaining out of habit or tradition even though they're harmful? The Victorians thought they were clean and civilized while living in conditions we find disgusting. What will the people of 2150 think about our practices in 2024? What myths about our era will they need to debunk? The story of Victorian hygiene is ultimately a story about the gap between perception and reality, about the power of social beliefs to override evidence, about the difficulty of changing established practices, even when they're deadly, and about the eventual triumph of knowledge and reform over ignorance and tradition. It is a reminder that every era, including our own, has its cherished myths that may not withstand historical scrutiny. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight into the shocking reality behind Victorian cleanliness myths. I hope these stories have given you a new perspective on the Victorian era, a deeper appreciation for modern hygiene and public health, and perhaps some thoughts about our own era's blind spots and how we might overcome them. As you drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to feel grateful for the simple comfort of being clean, for having access to safe water, for living in an era when we understand how disease is transmitted and how to prevent it. These are gifts that the Victorians didn't have, purchased with the suffering and deaths of millions of people over decades of ignorance and gradual enlightenment. Tonight, as you rest in your clean sheets, perhaps fresh from a shower that would have seemed dangerously indulgent to a Victorian, remember Eleanor Hartley and her 4-month gap between baths. Remember Charlotte Evans carrying chamber pots through grand houses. Remember Sarah Thompson watching her children die from preventable desire. Asses, remember Amelia Preston poisoning herself for beauty. And remember that the cleanliness and safety you enjoy are recent achievements. hard-won through the work of reformers like Florence Nightingale, scientists like John Snow and Louis Pasteur, engineers like Joseph Bazalgette, and countless others who pushed for change despite resistance. But before we drift off to sleep, let me tell you a few more stories that reveal just how deep the Victorian hygiene crisis went, because understanding the full scope helps us appreciate how revolutionary the changes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries really were. Let me tell you about Victorian dental hygiene, or rather the shocking lack thereof. Meet George Pemberton, a prosperous banker living in London in 1865. George is 45 years old, successful in business, well-dressed, well-mannered, and when he smiles, his teeth are brown, rotting, and many are missing entirely. This is completely normal for his age and class. According to research by Dr. Pristine from the University of Liverpool, whose work on Victorian dentistry reveals the appalling state of oral health, dental disease was nearly universal in Victorian Britain, affecting rich and poor alike. Though the wealthy at least had access to tooth extraction and crude dentures, while the poor simply suffered with rotting teeth until they fell out. George brushes his teeth, but not daily, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, using a brush with animal hair bristles and a tooth powder that might contain chalk, charcoal, or even ground up cuttlefish bone. Some tooth powders of the era contained brick dust or even arsenic. The concept of brushing after every meal doesn't exist. Flossing hasn't been invented yet in any practical sense. Toothpaste, as we know it, won't become common until the 1890s, and even then it is considered somewhat newfangled and unnecessary by many people. According to Professor Stanley Gelbier from King's College London, whose research on Victorian oral health documents the epidemic of tooth decay and gum disease, the Victorian diet was particularly destructive to teeth. The increasing availability of sugar, the popularity of sweet tea and sugary treats among those who could afford them, combined with poor oral hygiene and no understanding of how sugar feeds bacteria that cause cavities, meant that tooth decay was rampant. By age 40, many Victorians had lost most of their teeth. Dentures, when available, were crude and uncomfortable, often made from ivory, porcelain, or even teeth pulled from corpses. There is a grim trade in teeth, from dead soldiers after battles, sold to dentists who would set them into wealthy patients' mouths. George suffers from chronic tooth pain, gum disease, and bad breath that no amount of peppermint or clove oil can fully mask. But he doesn't think much of it because everyone around him has similar problems. Dental pain is just part of life, something you endure until the tooth falls out or you can afford to have it pulled. The idea that teeth could be preserved throughout life with proper care, that dental disease is preventable rather than inevitable, won't become common knowledge for decades. Now let me tell you about Victorian women's menstrual hygiene, because this is an area where the gap between Victorian propriety and actual practice was particularly stark. This topic was absolutely taboo in polite society, never discussed openly, and the shame and ignorance surrounding menstruation caused enormous suffering. Meet Margaret Wilson, a young woman living in Edinburgh in 1870. Margaret is 17, and she has been menstruating for about 4 years. According to research by Dr. Lara Friedenfelds from Utica College, whose work on the history of menstruation reveals the practices and attitudes of the Victorian era, Margaret's experience of menstruation would shock us today for its discomfort, inconvenience, and lack of proper hygiene products. Margaret doesn't have access to disposable menstrual products because they don't exist yet. The first commercial menstrual pads won't be available until the 1890s, and they won't become truly practical and affordable until the early 20th century. Instead, Margaret uses cloth rags folded and pinned into her undergarments, which she has to wash out herself after use and reuse month after month. According to historian Elizabeth Rears, whose research on Victorian women's health documents these practices, Many women found menstrual management difficult, embarrassing, and unhygienic. The cloths often leaked, causing stains that could be socially humiliating. They had to be washed discreetly, often by the woman herself, rather than sending them to the laundry with other household wash, because menstruation was considered too shameful to acknowledge. Women of different classes had different experiences. Wealthier women might have more and better quality cloths, might have private spaces to manage menstruation, might have personal maids who could help with washing. Poor women like factory workers or domestic servants might have only one or two rags, might have to work through their periods despite pain and discomfort, might have no private place to change or wash their menstrual cloths, and might face punishment or dismissal if their menstruation became visible or interfered with their work. According to research by Dr. Claire Debenham from the University of Kent, whose work on Victorian working women documents their health challenges, menstruation was a significant source of anxiety and difficulty for working class women who had limited resources and little privacy. The medical establishment made things worse with their theories about menstruation and appropriate behaviour. Victorian doctors believed that menstruation was a time when women were weak, sick, and needed rest, but they also believed that too much coddling would make women's constitutions even weaker. The advice was contradictory and often harmful. Women were told to avoid cold water, strenuous activity, mental exertion, and strong emotions during menstruation, but poor women who had to work had no choice but to ignore this advice. According to Professor Edward Shorter from the University of Toronto, whose research on the history of women's health reveals Victorian medical attitudes, doctors reinforced the idea that menstruation was a disease or disability, rather than a normal bodily function, which increased shame and anxiety around it. Margaret experiences severe menstrual cramps, which her mother tells her to endure silently because discussing such things is improper. She might dose herself with laudanum, a tincture of opium that is freely available and used for all sorts of pain. Many Victorian women became accidentally addicted to laudanum, partly because it was one of the few reliefs available for menstrual pain. Margaret's periods restrict her activities, make her anxious about potential embarrassment from leaks, and are never discussed openly with anyone except perhaps her mother or very close female friends in whispered conversations. The shame and secrecy surrounding menstruation wouldn't begin to ease until the early 20th century, when better products became available and public health campaigns began to frame menstruation as a normal, healthy process rather than a shameful sickness. Let me tell you about Victorian public toilets, or rather the shocking lack thereof, and what this meant for public hygiene. In the 1850s and 1860s, as cities grew and more people spent time in public spaces, shopping, working, attending events, the need for public toilet facilities became obvious. But Victorian sensibilities made it almost impossible to address this need properly. According to research by Professor Barbara Penner from University College London, whose work on the history of public toilets reveals the Victorian crisis of elimination, providing public toilets was fraught with moral panic, particularly around women's toilet facilities. The problem was this: acknowledging that people, especially respectable women, needed to urinate and defecate while away from home was considered indelicate and potentially immoral. The very idea that a proper lady might need to use a toilet was embarrassing to discuss. As a result, public toilet provision was inadequate, poorly designed, and often gender segregated in ways that disadvantaged women. The first public toilets in London, called public conveniences, were built in the 1850s, but they were primarily for men. Women's public toilets came later and were fewer in number, based on the assumption that respectable women wouldn't be out in public long enough to need them. According to historian Lee Jackson, whose research on Victorian London documents daily life in meticulous detail, the lack of adequate public toilets had several consequences. Men would often urinate in the street in alleys against walls, contributing to the horrific smell of Victorian cities. Women who couldn't do this without enormous social stigma simply stayed home more or carefully planned their outings to avoid being away from home too long. When women's public toilets did begin to appear, they were called ladies' waiting rooms or ladies' retiring rooms, euphemisms that avoided any direct mention of bodily functions. These facilities often charged a penny to enter, which is where the British euphemism, spending a penny for using the toilet, comes from. The inadequacy of public toilet provision was particularly hard on working class people who couldn't afford to pay for facilities and had to work long hours away from home. It was hard on women who were told they shouldn't be in public spaces, but also weren't provided basic facilities when they were. And it contributed to ongoing public health problems, because the lack of proper facilities meant that waste continued to be disposed of improperly in streets, alleys, and waterways. Now let me tell you about Victorian attitudes toward fresh air and outdoor spaces, because here is another area where their beliefs seem bizarre to us and had real health consequences. We've talked about how Victorians believed night air was dangerous, but their relationship with outdoor air in general was complicated and often counterproductive. According to research by Dr. Greg Mittman from the University of Wisconsin, whose work on the history of environmental health reveals Victorian ideas about air and disease, Victorians believed that certain types of air could make you sick, but their understanding of which air was dangerous and which was healthful was often exactly backward. Victorians worried about drafts, believed that sudden changes in temperature could cause illness, and often kept their homes sealed up tight. But they also believed in the health benefits of certain outdoor air, particularly mountain air or sea air, which led to the development of health resorts and sanatoriums in places like the Alps or the British seaside. Wealthy Victorians who could afford it would travel to these places to take the air as a cure for various ailments, particularly tuberculosis. The irony is that tuberculosis, one of the great killer diseases of the Victorian era, spread precisely because of poor ventilation in crowded indoor spaces. TB is an airborne disease that spreads when an infected person coughs or sneezes in an enclosed space. Victorian homes, with their sealed windows, heavy draperies, and poor air circulation, were perfect incubators for TB transmission. Victorian workplaces, factories with hundreds of workers crowded together in poorly ventilated spaces, tenements where entire families lived in one or two rooms, with windows kept shut against the supposedly dangerous night air. These were environments where TB flourished, according to Professor Fluring Condro from the University of Manchester, whose research on the history of tuberculosis documents its devastating impact. TB killed approximately 1 in 4 people in Victorian Britain and was responsible for more deaths than any other single cause. The disease was often romanticized in literature and art. The pale, thin, consumptive figure became almost fashionable, but the reality was horrific, a slow death by suffocation as the lungs were destroyed, during which the sufferer was highly contagious to family members and others in close contact. The cure, when it was eventually understood, was remarkably simple: fresh air, sunlight, good nutrition, and separation of patients from healthy people. Sanatoriums built in the early 20th century based on these principles, with open-air pavilions where patients could rest in sunlight and fresh air, were far more effective than Victorian attempts at treatment had been. The Victorian fear of fresh air and drafts, their habit of sealing up their homes and workplaces, had actually been making TB worse all along. Let me tell you about Victorian hair care and the particular challenges and dangers involved. Hair was incredibly important in Victorian culture, a marker of femininity for women and respectability for men, but the practices around hair care were often unhygienic and sometimes dangerous. Meet Sophia Hartwell, a young woman in Manchester in 1875, with beautiful long brown hair that reaches her waist. Sophia is proud of her hair and follows all the fashionable hair care advice of her era. According to research by Caroline Cox, a fashion historian whose work documents Victorian hair practices, Sophia's hair care routine would horrify modern dermatologists and hair care professionals. Sophia washes her hair infrequently, perhaps once a month, or even less often. Victorian advice manuals suggest that washing hair too frequently will damage it, make it fall out, or cause illness. Between washes, Sophia brushes her hair extensively, supposedly to distribute the natural oils and keep it healthy, but actually spreading dirt, dead skin cells, and potentially lice throughout her hair. She uses hair oils and pomades to keep her hair looking glossy and under control, products that often contain questionable ingredients, and that combined with infrequent washing can cause scalp problems and attract dirt. Victorian women often padded their elaborate hairstyles with rats, pieces of padding made from their own shed hair collected from brushes, or sometimes from purchased hair of questionable origin. These padding pieces were rarely if ever cleaned and could harbour bacteria, lice, and who knows what else. According to Dr. Susan Vincent from the University of York, whose research on Victorian hair culture documents these practices, scalp diseases, hair loss, and lice infestations were common problems, partly because of infrequent washing, and partly because of the elaborate hairstyles that were difficult to clean and made ideal environments for parasites. Victorian men had their own hair care issues. Moustaches and beards, which became increasingly popular through the Victorian era, required maintenance but were often improperly cleaned. Food and drink would get caught in facial hair, creating unsanitary conditions. Some men used waxes and pomades to style their facial hair, products that could become rancid or attract dirt. According to historian Alan Withy, whose research on the history of male grooming documents Victorian practices, facial hair was seen as a mark of masculinity and respectability, but the hygiene practices around it were often inadequate. Let me tell you about one more Victorian myth that persists today: the idea that Victorians were sexually repressed and therefore must have been very proper and clean about bodies and bodily functions. The reality is far more complicated. Yes, Victorian society had strict rules about public discussion of sex and the body, but behind closed doors, Victorian private life was often quite different from the public image, and the shame and secrecy around bodies and bodily functions actually made hygiene worse, not better, because it prevented open discussion of necessary practices. According to research by Professor Leslie Hall from the Wellcome Library, whose work on Victorian sexuality reveals the gap between public morality and private behaviour, Victorian attitudes toward the body were complicated and contradictory. The body was simultaneously idealized in art and literature, covered up and denied in daily life, and subjected to all sorts of invasive and inappropriate medical interventions. Women's bodies in particular were mysteries even to the women themselves, because proper ladies weren't supposed to know or discuss their own anatomy. This ignorance had real consequences for hygiene and health. Women didn't understand their own reproductive anatomy, didn't know how pregnancy occurred beyond vague euphemisms, didn't understand menstruation beyond that it was shameful, and didn't know how to prevent or treat common infections. According to Dr. Ornella Moscucci from the Royal Holloway University of London, whose research on Victorian gynecology reveals the medical profession's attitudes and practices, doctors themselves often had inadequate understanding of women's reproductive health, and their treatments were frequently harmful. Vaginal douching with all sorts of substances, some actively dangerous, was recommended for female complaints. Unnecessary surgeries, including removal of ovaries and clitorises for supposed psychological problems, were performed, and basic hygiene practices that could have prevented infections were unknown or ignored. The Victorian shame around bodies meant that people often didn't seek medical help for problems they were embarrassed to discuss. They suffered in silence with treatable conditions, or they turned to quack remedies advertised in the back pages of newspapers, often making things worse. The public face of Victorian propriety, the buttoned-up morality and refusal to acknowledge bodily realities, created an environment where ignorance and shame led to genuine suffering and poor health outcomes. As we near the end of our journey tonight, I want to tell you about the reformers, the people who gradually changed Victorian attitudes and practices around hygiene and created the foundation for modern public health. We've mentioned Florence Nightingale and John Snow, but there were many others. Edwin Chadwick, whose 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population documented the horrific living conditions in working-class neighbourhoods and advocated for government intervention in public health. Octavia Hill, who worked to improve housing conditions for the poor in London. Thomas Southwood Smith, a physician who advocated for public health reforms. Josephine Butler, who campaigned for women's health and rights. These reformers faced enormous resistance. Their proposals for government intervention in sanitation, housing and public health were denounced as socialism, as attacks on personal liberty, as unnecessary government overreach. The wealthy didn't want to pay taxes for sewers and clean water for the poor. Landlords didn't want to be forced to improve tenement housing. Manufacturers didn't want regulations that might cost them money. And the medical establishment was often the most resistant of all, clinging to their theories and their prestige, even when evidence contradicted them. According to Professor Simon Zretter from the University of Cambridge, whose research on Victorian public health documents the slow progress of reform, the improvements in sanitation and hygiene that eventually came in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods weren't automatic results of progress or technology. They were hard-fought political victories, achieved through decades of advocacy, documentation, and pressure from reformers who refused to accept that the poor had to die of preventable diseases. The modern infrastructure we take for granted, clean water systems, sewer systems, public health departments, building codes that require proper sanitation, all of these things exist because Victorian reformers fought for them against powerful opposition. The decline in mortality rates that began in the late 19th century, what demographic historians call the mortality transition, was one of the most important changes in human history. Within a couple of generations, life expectancy increased by decades. Child mortality plummeted. Epidemic diseases that had killed millions were brought under control. And most of this improvement came not from high-tech medical interventions, but from basic public health measures: clean water, proper sewage disposal, better housing, improved nutrition, and education about hygiene practices. The Victorians, or at least some of them, eventually learned from their mistakes and created systems that saved millions of lives. But before we close tonight's journey, let me tell you about a few more aspects of Victorian life that reveal just how pervasive the hygiene crisis was, touching every aspect of daily existence in ways both large and small. Let me tell you about Victorian laundry practices, because the way Victorians cleaned their clothes reveals another dimension of the hygiene challenge. Meet Mary O'Brien, an Irish immigrant working as a laundress in London in 1860. Mary is 30 years old, and she is one of thousands of women doing one of the hardest, most dangerous, and least respected jobs in Victorian society. According to research by Dr. Patricia E. Malcolmson from Queen's University, whose work on Victorian laundresses documents this brutal occupation, laundry work was back-breaking labour that often left women with permanent physical damage, chronic illness, and early death. Mary's workday begins at 4 a.m. and doesn't end until 10 p.m. or later. She works in a small, poorly ventilated laundry with several other women, standing for hours over huge tubs of scalding water. The water itself is often contaminated, drawn from the same questionable sources as drinking water. The soap Mary uses is harsh, made with lye and other caustic chemicals that strip the skin from her hands, leaving them cracked, bleeding, and constantly infected. She has no protective gloves. Those won't become common until well into the 20th century. According to historian Lucy Delap from the University of Cambridge, whose research on Victorian domestic labour reveals the health toll, laundresses had some of the highest rates of respiratory disease, skin conditions, and premature death of any occupational group. The laundry process itself is arduous and inadequate by modern standards. Heavily soiled items are soaked overnight in lye solution, then scrubbed by hand on washboards, then boiled in huge copper kettles over fires, then scrubbed again, then rinsed multiple times in cold water, then wrung out by hand or through a mangle. A dangerous device that could easily catch and crush fingers or hands, then hung to dry, then ironed with heavy flat irons, heated on stoves. The entire process for a large load of laundry might take 2 or 3 days. And despite all this labour, the laundry often wasn't truly clean by modern standards because the water was contaminated. The soap wasn't effective against many types of bacteria, and there was no understanding of how to properly disinfect fabrics. What is particularly disturbing is that Mary is washing items from multiple households together. Sheets and undergarments from a household where someone has tuberculosis or typhoid or any other infectious disease are washed in the same water, and potentially with the same equipment as items from healthy households. Mary herself is constantly exposed to whatever diseases her customers' laundry might carry, and she is spreading those diseases from household to household through improperly sanitized laundry. According to public health records from the era studied by Dr. Anne Hardy, laundries were recognized as sources of disease transmission, but little was done to regulate them or improve their practices until well into the 20th century. Mary charges very little for her services, just a few pence per load, because she is competing with dozens of other laundresses and with households that do their own washing. She can barely afford to feed herself and her children on what she earns. She lives in a single room in a tenement with no running water, no toilet except the shared privy in the courtyard, no heat except what her small stove provides. The irony is crushing. Mary spends her days washing other people's laundry, standing in water for hours, and yet she herself rarely has the opportunity or resources to properly wash her own clothes, or her children's clothes, or to bathe adequately. She is simultaneously immersed in water and suffering from inadequate hygiene. Now let me tell you about Victorian bedding and the creatures that shared Victorian beds. This is going to be uncomfortable, but it is important for understanding just how different Victorian hygiene was from ours. Victorian beds, even in wealthy homes, were often infested with bedbugs, fleas, and other parasites. According to research by Professor Bill Luckin from the University of Bolton, whose work on Victorian housing includes documentation of pest infestations, bedbugs were endemic in Victorian Britain, affecting homes across all social classes, though they were worse in the crowded tenements of the poor. Bedbugs are remarkably difficult to eradicate once they establish themselves. They hide in mattresses, bed frames, cracks in walls, and come out at night to feed on sleeping humans. Victorian mattresses were often stuffed with straw, horsehair, or feathers, materials that provided perfect habitat for bedbugs and were almost impossible to adequately clean or treat. Wealthier people might replace their mattresses more frequently, but working class families often kept the same infested mattress for years because they couldn't afford a new one. The treatments for bedbugs in the Victorian era were largely ineffective and sometimes dangerous. People might try dousing their beds with kerosene or turpentine, creating fire hazards. They might use mercury-based compounds, poisoning themselves while failing to eliminate the bugs. They might simply accept the bedbugs as an inevitable part of life, suffering through nightly bites, itching, and sleeplessness. According to Dr. Lisa Heschong from the University of California, whose research on historical sleeping environments documents these conditions, chronic sleep deprivation from bedbug infestations contributed to poor health, irritability, and reduced productivity, but was so common that people considered it normal. Fleas were another constant companion in Victorian homes, brought in by the rats and mice that infested most buildings, by domestic animals like cats and dogs, and by human visitors carrying them from one location to another. Fleas could transmit diseases including typhus. Though this wasn't understood in the Victorian era, they caused constant itching and discomfort, and they were nearly impossible to eliminate because the source, the rodent population, was out of control. Let me tell you about Victorian attitudes toward pets and animals in the home, because this is another area where hygiene practices were problematic. The Victorians loved their pets, particularly dogs and cats, and kept them in their homes as we do today. but their understanding of the hygiene issues associated with pets was minimal. According to historian Harriet Ritvo from MIT, whose work on Victorian human-animal relationships documents these practices, Victorian pets were often poorly groomed, might be allowed to sleep in beds with humans, were not given veterinary care for parasites or diseases, and their waste was often improperly managed. Dogs might be bathed occasionally, but cats were expected to groom themselves, and were rarely if ever bathed. Both could carry fleas, ticks, and other parasites into the home. Both could carry diseases transmissible to humans, including rabies, which was a significant problem in Victorian Britain. Dog and cat waste in urban areas contributed to the filth of streets and courtyards, and yet the Victorians saw no contradiction between their love of pets and their supposed concern for cleanliness and propriety. Bird keeping was also popular, with caged birds kept indoors in many Victorian homes. The bird cages were often inadequately cleaned, and bird droppings accumulated, creating respiratory hazards. Parrots and other exotic birds, increasingly popular as the British Empire expanded, could carry diseases unfamiliar to British doctors. But these birds were status symbols, marks of worldliness and wealth, and hygiene considerations took second place to fashion. Now, let me tell you about Victorian markets and food shopping, because the way food was sold reveals another aspect of the hygiene crisis. Meet Hannah Porter, a housewife in Birmingham in 1870, doing her marketing at a local outdoor market. Hannah is shopping for her family's meals, trying to get the best quality food at prices she can afford. According to research by Professor John Burnett from Brunel University, whose work on Victorian food and nutrition documents marketplace practices, the food Hannah buys is likely contaminated, adulterated, or spoiled, and she has almost no way of knowing which is which. The meat hanging in the butcher's stall has been there for hours or days, exposed to flies, dirt, and whatever else might land on it. There is no refrigeration, and while the butcher might use ice if he can afford it, most meat is simply hung and sold until it is gone, or until it is obviously rotten. The smell of the meat market in summer is overwhelming, a mixture of blood, decay, and the waste products of butchering. Hannah has learned to judge meat by smell and appearance, but bacteria and parasites aren't visible, and meat that looks acceptable might be teeming with organisms that will make her family sick. The milk Hannah buys is even more dangerous. It is sold from large cans, ladled into Hannah's container, and it is being transported from farms outside the city in unsanitary conditions, often adulterated with water to increase volume, sometimes with chalk dust or other substances to make watered-down milk look whiter and thicker. According to Dr. Peter Atkins from University College London, whose research on the Victorian milk supply documents its dangers, milk was one of the most common sources of disease transmission in Victorian cities. Tuberculosis was frequently spread through milk from infected cows. Typhoid and other diseases were spread through milk contaminated by dirty water, used for adulteration, or by the unwashed hands of those who handled it. The bread Hannah buys might be adulterated with alum to make it whiter, or with chalk or plaster to increase its weight. The tea might be mixed with used tea leaves that have been dried and sold again, or with leaves from other plants that look similar. The coffee might be mixed with chicory, or even with roasted and ground. The butter might be mixed with lard or other cheaper fats. Virtually every common food item could be and often was adulterated, and Hannah has no reliable way to detect it. According to historian B. Wilson, whose work on food adulteration documents Victorian practices, it wasn't until the 1870s and 1880s, when food adulteration laws were finally passed and enforced, that consumers could have any confidence in the purity of what they were buying. Let me tell you about Victorian schools and the hygiene practices, or lack thereof, that affected children's education and health. Meet Thomas Baker, a schoolmaster running a small school for working-class children in Manchester in 1865. Thomas has about 50 students, ranging in age from 5 to 12, crammed into a single room with no proper ventilation, inadequate heating, and minimal sanitation facilities. According to research by Professor Jane Martin from the Institute of Education, whose work on Victorian schooling documents conditions in working-class schools. These educational environments were breeding grounds for disease and contributed significantly to child mortality and morbidity. Thomas's students come from poor families. Many of them are inadequately clothed, especially in winter. Many are malnourished, making them more susceptible to disease. Many are already sick with chronic conditions like tuberculosis, rickets, or eye infections. But they come to school anyway because their families need them to get an education, however minimal, that might eventually lead to slightly better employment. The children sit on benches packed tightly together, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces, sharing the few books and slates available. If one child has a contagious disease, and one almost always does, it spreads rapidly through the entire school. There is no hand-washing facility in the school. There is an outdoor privy, shared by all 50 students, that is rarely cleaned and often unusable due to overflow and filth. Children simply hold their waste as long as they can, or they have accidents, adding to the unsanitary conditions. The schoolroom floor is swept occasionally, but rarely scrubbed. In winter, with the windows sealed shut against the cold and the meagre fire providing minimal heat, the air becomes thick with the breath and odours of 50 unwashed children. According to Dr. Bernard Harris from the University of Southampton, whose research on children's health in Victorian Britain documents the impact of school conditions, schools were recognised even at the time as significant sources of disease transmission, particularly for respiratory illnesses and eye infections. Thomas himself does his best, but he is working with almost no resources, paid very little, and expected to maintain discipline and provide education under impossible conditions. He has no training in health or hygiene, doesn't understand disease transmission, and can't afford to send sick children home because their families need them in school. The idea of school nurses, regular health inspections, or systematic hygiene education won't become common until the early 20th century. Let me tell you about Victorian transportation and the hygiene issues created by how people and goods move through cities. Victorian cities were full of horses. Thousands upon thousands of horses, pulling carts, carriages, omnibuses and wagons through the streets every day. And these horses produced enormous amounts of waste. According to historian Joel Tarr from Carnegie Mellon University, whose research on urban horse populations documents this problem, a single horse produces approximately 20 to 30 pounds of manure per Dalton year. In a city like London, with hundreds of thousands of horses, that meant literally tons of horse manure accumulating in the streets every single day. In dry weather, this manure dried and turned to dust that blew into homes, shops, and lungs. In wet weather, it turned to a toxic sludge that people and vehicles splashed through. The smell was overwhelming. Flies bred in the manure by the millions, then spread into homes and food establishments, carrying disease on their legs and bodies. Dead horses, when they collapsed in the street from exhaustion or disease, might lie there for days before being removed because moving a dead horse was difficult, and someone had to be paid to do it. The supposed solution to the horse manure problem, street sweepers, were often ineffective. According to research by urban historian Martin Daunton from the University of Cambridge, street sweeping was irregular, poorly funded, and the swept-up manure was often just moved to a different location rather than properly disposed of. Some of it was sold as fertilizer, but there was far more supply than demand. The rest accumulated in enormous piles that became hazards in their own right. Victorian public transportation was particularly unhygienic. Omnibuses and later trams and trains were crowded, poorly ventilated, and rarely cleaned thoroughly. People of all social classes, healthy and sick, clean and filthy, were pressed together in these vehicles. The straw scattered on omnibus floors, meant to provide cushioning and absorb spills, actually became filthy and was a harbour for bacteria and vermin. According to Dr. T.C. Barker from the London School of Economics, whose research on Victorian transport documents these conditions, Public transportation was a significant vector for disease transmission, particularly during epidemic outbreaks when sick people continued to use transportation and spread their illnesses to others. Now let me tell you about Victorian hotels and lodging houses, because travellers faced particular hygiene challenges. The quality of lodging varied enormously by price, but even respectable middle-class hotels had hygiene standards that would appall us today. Sheets might be changed between guests, or they might not be. Mattresses were rarely, if ever, cleaned and could harbour bedbugs, fleas, and who knows what else from previous occupants. Shared facilities, dining rooms, sitting rooms, toilets meant constant exposure to strangers and their diseases. Working-class lodging houses were far worse. According to research by Professor David Englander from the Open University, whose work on Victorian housing documents lodging house conditions, the cheapest lodging houses were essentially dormitories where dozens of people slept in a single room, on mattresses on the floor, with no privacy, no sanitation, and no attempt at hygiene. These lodging houses were breeding grounds for disease, particularly for epidemics of typhus and tuberculosis among the homeless and transient poor. The phrase "not fit for a dog" was literally true. The conditions were worse than many people would accept for their animals. Let me tell you about one final Victorian character whose story encapsulates so much of what we've discussed tonight. Meet Emma Thompson, not related to the Thompson family we met earlier, a woman born in London in 1850 who lived until 1925, spanning the entire late Victorian era and living long enough to see the dramatic changes of the early 20th century. Emma's life story, reconstructed from census records, medical records, and family documents, according to genealogical research by local historians, gives us a personal perspective on how the Victorian hygiene crisis affected one individual across her lifetime. Emma was born into a working-class family in Whitechapel, one of London's poorest neighbourhoods. Her mother died of puerperal fever when Emma was 3, a victim of the unsanitary childbirth practices of 1853. Emma and her siblings were raised by their father and a series of relatives. Emma survived childhood, which was itself an achievement. 3 of her 5 siblings died before age 10 of scarlet fever, diphtheria and fever, probably typhoid. Emma learned early that death was commonplace, that sickness was normal, that suffering was expected. As a young woman, Emma worked as a domestic servant, experiencing the conditions we described earlier when we talked about Charlotte Evans. She married at 22 in 1872 to a carpenter. She had 6 children between 1873 and 1885. 2 of them died in infancy, one of diarrhea and one of convulsions, probably from an infection. This was heartbreaking, but not unusual. Emma had seen many of her friends and neighbours lose children. She grieved but also accepted it as God's will, as the way life was. Emma's married life was spent in a small house in Bethnal Green, an improvement over the tenement of her childhood, but still crowded, still lacking proper sanitation, still subject to the hygiene challenges of Victorian London. She bathed rarely, washed her clothes infrequently, cooked on a coal stove that filled the house with smoke, drew water from a pump that was probably contaminated, and managed her household with the limited knowledge and resources available to working-class women of her era. She did her best, loved her family, worked hard, and lived with constant low-level illness that she considered normal, chronic digestive problems, frequent headaches, persistent cough, aching joints. But here is what is remarkable about Emma. She lived long enough to see everything change. By 1900, her neighbourhood had proper sewers. By 1905, the water supply had been cleaned up and was safe to drink. By 1910, public health campaigns were teaching people about hygiene, hand washing, and disease prevention. Emma's grandchildren, born in the 1890s and early 1900s, had dramatically better survival rates than her own children had. Only 1 of her 8 grandchildren died in childhood, compared to 2 of her 6 children. Her grandchildren went to schools with better sanitation, ate food that was regulated for safety, had access to medical care that was beginning to understand disease causation and prevention. Emma herself lived to be 75, dying in 1925. In her later years, she had access to things that would have seemed miraculous in her youth: electric lights, regular refuse collection, public health nurses, better housing conditions. She lived long enough to see the first antibiotics being developed, though they wouldn't become available until after her death. She saw hygiene transform from a luxury to a commonplace expectation, saw child mortality plummet, saw life expectancy rise dramatically. The world of 1925, when Emma died, was profoundly different from the world of 1850 when she was born, and much of that difference came from improvements in basic hygiene and sanitation. Let me tell you about Victorian industrial pollution and how it compounded the hygiene crisis in ways that affected everyone, rich and poor alike. Victorian Britain was the workshop of the world, the first industrialized nation, and the environmental cost was staggering. Meet William Harris, a factory worker in Sheffield in 1870, one of the great steel-producing cities of the empire. William works in a cutlery factory, and the air he breathes, both at work and at home, is thick with pollution that is slowly killing him. According to research by Professor Peter Thorsheim from the University of North Carolina, whose work on Victorian air pollution documents the health crisis created by industrialization, the air quality in industrial cities like Sheffield, Manchester, and Birmingham was so poor that it contributed significantly to respiratory disease, reduced life expectancy, and created what we would now call an environmental health emergency. The smoke from thousands of coal-burning factories, workshops, and home fires created a thick, choking fog that hung over industrial cities for much of the year. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. The smoke contained sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter that penetrated deep into the lungs. According to Dr. Stephen Mosley from the University of Birmingham, whose research on Victorian environmental health reveals the impact of industrial pollution, workers in heavy industry had life expectancies 10 to 15 years shorter than agricultural workers, primarily due to respiratory diseases caused by air pollution and workplace exposure to toxic substances. William's workplace is a nightmare from a modern health and safety perspective. There is no ventilation system, no protective equipment, no safety regulations. The air is thick with metal dust from grinding and polishing operations. The noise is deafening, causing permanent hearing damage to most workers. The machinery is dangerous and injuries are common, often resulting in permanent disability or death. When William gets metal dust in his lungs, as he inevitably does, there is no treatment, no workers' compensation, no protection. He simply coughs and wheezes and continues working because he has no choice. His family depends on his wages. The pollution doesn't stop when William leaves the factory. His neighbourhood, a densely packed area of workers' housing near the industrial district, is perpetually covered in a layer of grime. Laundry hung out to dry comes back in dirtier than it went out, covered in soot and ash. Windows are kept closed not to keep out cold or rain, but to try to keep out the worst of the smoke, which means homes are poorly ventilated and stuffy. The River Don, which runs through Sheffield, is so polluted with industrial waste, dyes, chemicals and sewage, that nothing can live in it. It is essentially a moving toxic sludge, yet children play near it because there is nowhere else to go. According to research by Professor Bill Luckin, Victorian cities had pollution levels that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. In London, the combination of domestic coal burning and industrial emissions created what became known as pea super fogs, so thick that people literally couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. These fogs were not just fog mixed with smoke. They were toxic events that killed thousands of people, particularly the elderly, children, and those with existing respiratory conditions. The Great Smog of 1952, which killed approximately 12,000 people in London, was the culmination of a century of worsening air pollution that the Victorians had largely ignored or accepted as the inevitable price of progress. Now let me tell you about Victorian medical quackery and the patent medicine industry, because the lack of effective medical treatment and the desperation of sick people created a perfect environment for frauds and charlatans. Meet Dr. James Morrison, not a real doctor at all, but a patent medicine salesman in London in 1860. Morrison sells Morrison's pills, which he claims can cure literally everything: cancer, consumption, cholera, gout, rheumatism, skin diseases, mental illness, and dozens of other conditions, according to research by Professor Roy Porter from the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine, whose work on medical quackery documents the scale of the problem. The Victorian patent medicine industry was enormous, worth millions of pounds, and almost entirely fraudulent. Morrison's pills, like most patent medicines, contain ingredients that range from harmless to actively dangerous. They might contain sugar, flour, and colouring, making them useless, but at least not harmful. Or they might contain mercury, lead, arsenic, or other toxic substances that will poison the people taking them. Morrison's advertising is everywhere, in newspapers, on posters, in pamphlets distributed on street corners. The testimonials are fabricated, the medical claims are complete lies, and there is no regulation preventing any of this. People desperate for relief from illness, unable to afford proper medical care even when it might help, spend their limited money on these useless or dangerous concoctions. The most disturbing aspect of the patent medicine industry is how it preyed on women and their health concerns. Dozens of medicines were marketed specifically for female complaints, vague euphemisms for menstrual problems, reproductive health issues, or just general malaise that women experienced. According to historian Sarah Stage, whose research on Victorian patent medicines reveals the gendered nature of medical fraud, many of these female tonics contained significant amounts of alcohol or opiates, creating addiction while providing no actual medical benefit. Women who would never consider themselves drinkers or drug users became addicted to their daily dose of tonic, unaware that they were consuming morphine or laudanum. Let me tell you about Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, one of the most famous Victorian patent medicines, marketed specifically to women. The compound was invented by Lydia Pinkham in Massachusetts in the 1870s and became wildly popular in both America and Britain. It was advertised as a cure for painful menstruation, menopausal symptoms, pregnancy complications, and various other women's health issues. The ingredients included herbs of questionable medicinal value and approximately 18% alcohol, making it essentially a strong alcoholic beverage disguised as medicine. According to research on patent medicine formulations, many women were taking multiple doses per Dalton Y of what was essentially wine, becoming dependent on it while their underlying health problems went untreated. Victorian medicine's failure to provide effective treatment for common ailments meant that people turned to these quack remedies out of desperation, and the shame around certain conditions, particularly anything related to sex or reproduction, meant that people preferred to buy anonymous patent medicines from advertisements, rather than consult a doctor about embarrassing problems. The patent medicine industry thrived on a combination of medical ignorance, desperation, shame, and lack of regulation, and it caused immense harm. Now let me tell you about Victorian prisons and workhouses, institutions where the hygiene crisis was at its absolute worst. Meet Elizabeth Fry, not a prisoner but a reformer who visited London's Newgate prison in 1813 and was horrified by what she found. Her work came earlier than our main Victorian period, but the conditions she documented persisted throughout the Victorian era. According to research by Professor Eliza Levine from Oxford Brookes University, whose work on institutional care documents conditions in prisons and workhouses, these institutions were breeding grounds for disease, with death rates far higher than in the general population. Newgate Prison, one of London's main facilities for holding prisoners awaiting trial or execution, was a hellhole of filth and disease. prisoners were crowded together in dark, dank cells with no sanitation, except buckets that overflowed and were rarely emptied. There was no separation of prisoners by gender, age, or type of crime, so children, women, hardened criminals, and people awaiting trial for minor offences were all mixed together. Disease spread rapidly through the prison. Typhus, called gall fever, because it was so associated with prisons, killed prisoners and sometimes infected judges, lawyers, and spectators who attended trials. According to historian David J. Rothman, whose research on institutional history documents these conditions, prison mortality rates in the early Victorian period could be as high as 25% per year, meaning that a quarter of the prison population died annually from disease, malnutrition, and brutal conditions. Workhouses, institutions designed to house the destitute poor, were scarcely better. Victorian social policy was based on the principle of less eligibility, the idea that conditions in workhouses should be worse than the worst conditions outside, to discourage people from seeking relief. According to Professor Lynn Holland-Lees from the University of Pennsylvania, whose research on Victorian poor relief documents workhouse conditions, this policy meant that workhouses were deliberately kept harsh, with minimal food, hard labour, and punitive rules designed to make the experience as unpleasant as possible. The hygiene in workhouses was appalling. Inmates, as residents were called, were crowded into dormitories with minimal bedding, poor ventilation, and inadequate heating. Sanitation facilities were primitive and insufficient for the number of people using them. Food was monotonous and of poor quality, contributing to malnutrition and scurvy. The sick, the elderly, the disabled, and the able-bodied were often housed together, meaning that diseases spread easily. Childbirth in workhouses was particularly dangerous, with mortality rates for both mothers and infants far higher than in the general population, because of the poor nutrition, stress, and unsanitary conditions. Let me tell you about a specific person in a workhouse. Meet Annie Sullivan, a widow with 3 young children, forced into the workhouse in Manchester in 1865 when her husband died and she had no way to support herself. According to the harsh rules of the workhouse system, Annie is separated from her children upon entry. Boys over 7, girls over 7, and younger children are housed in different sections, and mothers like Annie are allowed only limited, supervised contact with their children. This separation, designed to discourage families from seeking relief, causes immense psychological suffering. Annie can hear her children crying for her but can't comfort them. She works long hours at tedious tasks like picking oakum, unravelling old rope to be recycled, work that leaves her hands bloody and torn. She is hungry, exhausted, desperate, and powerless to protect her children from the brutal conditions they're enduring. According to historian Ruth Richardson, whose work on workhouse conditions documents the human cost, children in workhouses had extraordinarily high mortality rates. Disease, malnutrition, and neglect killed children by the thousands. The system was ostensibly designed to help the poor but actually punished them for their poverty, treating them as moral failures rather than victims of economic circumstances. The workhouse system persisted throughout the Victorian era and wasn't fully dismantled until the 20th century welfare reforms. Let me tell you about Victorian attitudes toward alcohol and how this intersected with hygiene and public health. Victorians drank heavily across all social classes for several reasons. Water was often unsafe, so beer and later tea were considered healthier alternatives. Alcohol was used as pain relief, as medicine, as a coping mechanism for the hardships of Victorian life. According to research by Professor James Nichols from London Metropolitan University, whose work on Victorian drinking culture documents consumption patterns, per capita alcohol consumption in Victorian Britain was significantly higher than today, and alcohol-related problems, including domestic violence, poverty, and health issues, were endemic. Working-class men spent a significant portion of their wages on alcohol, often drinking in pubs every evening. This had predictable consequences for their families, who went without adequate food, clothing, or heating so that the breadwinner could drink. Women also drank, though this was more hidden because of social stigma. Middle-class women who wouldn't be seen in a pub might consume significant amounts of alcohol in the form of patent medicines or home remedies. According to historian Jessica Warner, whose research on women and alcohol documents Victorian drinking patterns, many Victorian women were functional alcoholics without recognizing it, their drinking hidden behind the respectability of medical tonics. The temperance movement, which gained strength throughout the Victorian period, tried to address the alcohol problem through moral persuasion and legal restriction. Temperance activists, many of them women, documented the devastation that alcohol caused in working-class families: wages drunk away, children going hungry, wives beaten, homes neglected. According to Professor Lillian Lewis-Shimon from Franklin and Marshall College, whose research on the temperance movement documents its evolution, temperance became intertwined with other reform movements, including women's rights, because many women saw male drinking as a source of their oppression and poverty. But the temperance movement, for all its good intentions, sometimes made things worse by increasing shame and secrecy around drinking, rather than addressing its root causes. And it didn't address the fundamental problem that people were drinking partly because their lives were so difficult, because they were in chronic pain, because they needed to escape the hardships of Victorian life, and because safe drinking water was often unavailable. The alcohol problem was both a cause and a symptom of the broader Victorian hygiene and health crisis. Now, let me tell you about Victorian colonialism and how hygiene myths were exported globally with devastating consequences. The Victorian British Empire spanned the globe, and British colonisers brought with them not only their military power and economic systems, but also their beliefs about hygiene, cleanliness, and civilization. According to research by Professor Dane Kennedy from George Washington University, whose work on British imperialism documents colonial attitudes and practices, the British convinced themselves that they were bringing civilization and cleanliness to supposedly barbarous peoples, when in reality, Victorian hygiene practices were often inadequate or actively harmful in tropical climates. British colonisers in India, for example, maintained Victorian practices that made little sense in a hot climate. They wore multiple layers of heavy clothing, sealed their homes against supposedly dangerous night air, avoided bathing too frequently, and created colonial cities with inadequate sanitation that became disease traps. According to historian David Arnold from the University of Warwick, whose research on medicine and colonialism in India reveals the health consequences, colonial cities like Calcutta had catastrophic mortality rates, particularly during cholera epidemics, partly because British authorities refused to learn from indigenous practices that might have provided better hygiene outcomes. The irony is that many indigenous practices around hygiene were actually superior to Victorian practices. Regular bathing was common in many cultures that the British colonised, while Victorians bathed rarely. Some cultures had sophisticated systems for waste disposal that the British ignored or destroyed, replacing them with inadequate European-style systems. But colonial ideology insisted that European ways were inherently superior, that cleanliness was a marker of civilization that non-Europeans lacked, and that colonial subjects needed to be taught proper hygiene by their British rulers. This colonial hygiene discourse had racist dimensions that justified British rule and oppression. According to Professor Warwick Anderson from the University of Sydney, whose research on colonial medicine documents the racialization of hygiene, British colonizers associated cleanliness with whiteness and civilization, dirtiness with dark skin and barbarism. They ignored evidence that contradicted these beliefs, and they implemented hygiene policies that served colonial power more than they served public health. The Victorian hygiene crisis was exported globally, with colonial subjects often suffering even worse health outcomes than people in Britain itself. Let me tell you about a specific example: the hill stations of British India. These were towns built in mountainous areas where British officials and their families could escape the heat and supposed diseases of the plains. According to research by Dane Kennedy specifically on hill stations, these communities were designed to recreate British conditions in India, with British-style homes, gardens, clubs, and social practices. But the attempt to maintain Victorian lifestyles in a completely different climate and environment created its own problems. The homes were damp and mouldy, contributing to respiratory disease. The sewage systems were inadequate for the population density, and the social isolation and rigid class hierarchies created psychological stress that manifested in high rates of alcoholism, mental breakdown, and domestic violence. As we move toward the close of our journey tonight, let me tell you about the legacy of Victorian hygiene myths and why understanding this history matters today. The Victorian era established many of the systems and infrastructure that we still use: urban sewer systems, water treatment plants, public health departments, building codes. These were enormous achievements, hard-won through decades of reform and advocacy. But the Victorian era also established patterns of thought and social inequality that persist today. The Victorian association of cleanliness with class and moral worth. The idea that poor hygiene is a personal failing rather than a structural problem. These beliefs still influence how we think about public health. According to contemporary public health scholars, when we blame individuals for their health problems, rather than addressing the social determinants of health like poverty, housing, and access to clean water, we're echoing Victorian attitudes. When we underfund public health infrastructure and then express surprise when disease outbreaks occur, we're repeating Victorian mistakes. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to 2023 revealed how many Victorian-era debates remain unresolved. Debates about individual liberty versus collective responsibility for public health, about the role of government in mandating health measures, about who bears the cost of public health infrastructure. These are the same debates the Victorians had. The anti-maskers of COVID had their Victorian predecessors in the anti-vaccinationists, who protested smallpox vaccination. The modern hesitancy to fund public housing and sanitation infrastructure for the poor echoes Victorian resistance to spending money on sewers and clean water for working-class neighbourhoods. Understanding Victorian hygiene history helps us appreciate how recent our modern comforts really are and how fragile they are. The clean water coming from your tap is not a natural right or an inevitable feature of civilization. It exists because Victorian reformers fought for it, because engineers designed systems to deliver it, because governments were pressured to fund the infrastructure, and it persists only as long as we maintain that infrastructure and extend it to everyone. In many parts of the world, and even in poor communities in wealthy nations, Victorian-level sanitation problems persist today, with people lacking access to clean water, proper toilets, and adequate hygiene facilities. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the ordinary miracles of modern hygiene, for the invisible protections that keep you safe, and for the progress that is possible when we're willing to question our assumptions, accept new evidence, and change our practices even when change is difficult. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you are cleaner, safer, and healthier than any Victorian ever was, and that this comfort you enjoy is built on the foundations of knowledge painfully acquired and reforms stubbornly achieved. Good night, dear friends, and may your dreams be as clean and pure as the Victorians imagined themselves to be, but never actually were.